Masechet Zevaḥim, Daf Lamed Het. We mentioned in the Mishnah that according to Bet Hillel, B'di'avad, all you need is one sprinkling. And that's true for Korban Chatat, where usually for Korban Chatat you should have 4 lechatechila. But B'di'avad, if you did only one sprinkling on one corner, that's sufficient and it atones. According to Bet Hillel, you need at least 2 for Korban Chatat. Bet Hillel and Bet Shammai agree that for other korbanot, it's sufficient to have just one, although ideally it should be 2 corners. Now, we already brought one proof on yesterday's daf, but now we're going to see yet another source for Bet Hillel. V'tana ma'iteh la'mahacha v'chiper 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 mipnei hadin. In Vayikra chapter 4, the same chapter we've been discussing that lists all the different types of korban hatat, it says the word v'chiper 3 times. It says it when regarding the korban hatat that's brought by a king, and also by an ordinary person's goat, or an ordinary person who brings a sheep, says v'chiper. Now, why does it have to say v'chiper 3 times? It's in order to help us with the following logical inference that we will try to make, but we're going to get stuck with it, and we're going to need these 3 words in order to help us out. And ultimately, we're going to have a source for Bet Hillel. Sheyachol, v'alo din hu, nemru damim lemata v'nemru damim lema'ala. Ma matan damim ha'amurim lemata shenetanan b'matana achat kiper, af damim ha'amurim lema'ala shenetanan b'matana achat kiper. We could use the following reasoning. The Torah talks about blood that's placed below the red line. That's for most korbanot. And it also talks about a korban hatat, where one places the blood above the line. Specifically, it's dabbed onto the corners all the way on top of the mizbeach. Now, let's compare them and say, just like the korbanot, for which you have to put the blood below the line, if you do only one, everybody agrees you got atoned. Ideally, it should be 2 corners, but if you only do one, kiper. So too, let's compare them. It makes sense. This is blood, this is blood. Okay, one's below, one's above. But let's assume, if we don't know otherwise, that will be the same. And therefore, also blood that's applied above the red line. If you do one, that's sufficient. Lechatechila should be 4, but 1 would be sufficient. That would be one line of reasoning. But we can propose another one. Oh, kelach lederech zeh. Maybe you should go a different way. נאמרו דמים בפנים ונאמרו דמים בחוץ. מה דמים האמורים בפנים? חיסר אחת מן המתנות לא עשה ולא כלום. אף דמים האמורים בחוץ, חיסר אחת מן המתנות לא עשה ולא כלום. The Torah talks about applying blood inside the sanctuary, and also the mizbach haketoret inside, for some korbanot, like a certain korban chatat of a kohen gadol, some of the sacrifices on Yom Kippur are applied inside, and the Torah also teaches about blood that's applied on the outside mizbeach. So let's compare those two and say, just like the blood that is spoken about on the inside, if you are missing any one of them, it's as if you did nothing. There you have to apply to all 4 corners of the mizbach haketoret inside, and if you miss just one of them, then it's 0. So too, this should be comparable. The blood that's placed on the outside, also, if you miss any one of them, you did nothing. You have to do all 4 for a korban hatat. So that's also a comparison. So we have these 2 comparisons. Which one's going to win? Let's see which one is more similar. Maybe we should compare the outside with the outside, the one below and above, and not compare the outside applications to the inside applications. And if we do that, that's the first derivation, that the outside application below, 1 is enough, so too, the other outside application above, 1 is enough. So kachatat would be enough for 1. And in that case, we wouldn't need any other derivation. That would be the source for Bet Hillel. It would just be by comparison of the sprinklings below. Or we can go a different way and say, Danin chatat v'arba keranot mechatat v'arba keranot. We should compare a korban chatat that ideally should be placed on 4 corners with another korban chatat that ideally should be placed on 4 corners. That's the korban chatat outside, and the korban chatat inside. It also should be 4 corners. ideally. And therefore, since that's comparison, that is a closer comparison, we should learn from there and learn that if you're missing one, it's no good. And don't bring me the one outside, the other one that's outside below the line, that's not a korban chatat and does not need 4 applications ideally. So therefore, that one is more different. So now we're stuck again because we have some ways to compare it to this, and for other reasons you can argue that you should compare it to that. And so now we are at a crossroads. Which one are we going to do? That's why we need the pasuk Talmud Omar v'chiper v'chiper v'chiper. That's why it has 3 times this word. V'chiper af al pi shelo natan ela shalosh. The word v'chiper, to atone, is coming to show that, this can atone. It's powerful. And it can atone even if you're missing one of the 4 and you have only 3. That's you learn from one word. V'chiper af al pi shelo natan ela shetayim. The second instance of v'chiper will teach even if you're missing yet another one and you have only 2 sprinklings. V'chiper af al pi shelo natan ela achat. And the third one, each one takes away one of the dabbings on the corner. And so the last one says, even if you're missing 3 and you have only 1, that's sufficient. And there you go. That's a source for Bet Hillel. We ask, wait a second, don't we need the v'chiper in each place to teach us the context itself? That for that particular korban, like for the king, if you do this, then he gets atonement. So you can't, it's not an extra word. Don't we need it for its own context? Amarava bar ada mari azberali amar kera v'chiper v'nislach zohi kapara zohi selicha. Rava said that bar ada mari explained to him that the word, the phrase there, the pasuk says v'chiper, and then later on it says v'nislach. Now that's a synonym, being atoned for or getting forgiveness. That's the same thing. So really, if you just had v'nislach, that he gets forgiveness, then you'd know it worked. He got atonement. So therefore, the word v'chiper is in fact extra, and therefore we can use these 3 words to teach us this law of Bet Hillel. Another challenge against this derivation. Emma v'chiper af al pi shelo natan ela shalosh lema'ala ve'achat lemata. V'chiper af al pi shelo natan ela shetayim lemata u'shtayim lema'ala. V'chiper af al pi shelo natan lema'ala ela lemata. How do you know that each word v'chiper is coming to take away a placement altogether? Maybe it just says that, the first chiper says, listen, ideally you should put the blood on all the 4 corners all the way on top. The first v'chiper says, even if you didn't put all 4 on top, but you put 3 on top on the corner, and 1 you put underneath. Not that you didn't put it at all, that you put it under the red line, but you still put it somewhere. That's okay. And the second v'chiper is coming to teach that even if you put 2 above 2 on top and 2 below the line, then that would still be okay. And the third v'chiper, at this point the Gemara jumps and from 2 to 0. And so maybe the third kippur will teach you that even if you don't put on top at all, rather only put on the bottom. It's a little strange as jumping from 2 all the way to 0. Perhaps the point is that if you're already putting only 1 on top and 3 on the bottom, that's like mostly on the bottom. So that means the top is not very important. So you may as well just put all on the bottom. If anything, that at least you have all in the same place rather than up and down. The Gemara in the second is going to notice this and say, why don't you go from 3 to 2 down to 1? In any case, if we assume that you jumped from 2 down to 0, and now the 3 instances of v'chiper are saying the things on top, the sprinklings on top, are not essential. You can have 2 up and 2 down. You know what? You could have all of them down, and maybe that's what v'chiper it comes to teach, and does not teach that you can dispense with the dabbing at all. You have to do it somewhere, but you could do it below instead of above. So maybe it means that, and is not teaching us what Bet Hillel says, which is you only need 1 out of the 4 completely. You just skip the other 3 completely. Amar Rav Ada bar Yitzchak, imken bitarta torat arba kedanot. Ada bar Yitzchak says, if you're going to learn that that all 4 can be on the bottom, then you cancel the entire law of placing it on the 4 corners. And the Torah says you have to put it on the 4 corners. So I understand, okay, you missed a corner, you put 1. that could be. You still have a law of putting it on some corners, but if you're going to tell me that all can be on the bottom, and now you canceled the whole Torah law, that's impossible. No derivation can tell you that you ruined the whole thing. Where we ask about that, wait, if the Torah says so, if Hashem says in the Torah that you don't have to do anything, then you don't have to do it. Hashem is in charge. He's the one that commanded you in the first place that you should put on the corners, and if this derivation really means that, then so be it. So Hashem said, you know what? You put it on the bottom. It's okay, and you don't have to do the four corners, right? You don't have to worry about canceling the law if that's what the Torah itself says. So that can't be the reason why we don't use this derivation. And so now we need another way to save that there will be a derivation for Bet Hillel. Amarava ezu davar shesarich shalosh heve omer elu keranot. Rava says, what is an issue where you would need 3 instances of v'chiper as opposed to 4? Well, that's placement on the corners as opposed to not placing it at all. In other words, if the v'chipers were coming to teach how many you can do below the line, and ultimately you wanted to teach that you can do them all below the line, in that case, you would need 4 v'chipers, because you really can't skip from 2 to 0 as we did before. You'd say lecha techila, you need 4 above on the corners, and then 1 chiper down to 3, down to 2, down to 1, down to 0. So you need 4 v'chipers to say you can put them all on the bottom. The fact that we have only 3 v'chipers teaches that it's not telling us that what you can put on the bottom as opposed to the top, but rather that we should read it as we did at the beginning as a proof for Bet Hillel, that you should do 4 corners lecha techila. 1 v'chiper is saying, okay, put 3 corners only, and the 4th one, no sprinkling at all. Then another v'chiper to make it down to 2, another one down to 1. Now, that's all you're going to have. You're never going to say 4 v'chipers and then don't do any sprinkling at all. That's impossible. You can't get atonement without doing any sprinkling. So therefore, obviously, 1 is going to be the absolute minimum. And so the fact that you have 3 means that it is about this issue of Bet Hillel, of not sprinkling at all, and not about being above or below. Ema v'chiper, afapi shelo natan ela achat lemala v'shalosh lemata. Wait, another objection. Maybe the word v'chiper actually is telling you how many you can do below the line, and there's 3 to tell you that you can do 3 below the line, but 1 has to be above the line. That's why there's 3. So 3 can work with that reading as well. No. We never find any precedent that you place blood, some of it above and some of it below. You're always going to put blood all on the top, all on the bottom, all in the same place. And so therefore it's impossible that the Torah would say that you can do some above and some below. No, and now we're going to bring a few examples that potentially where it seems that you are putting the blood in 2 different places. And the first example is from the Mishnah in Masechet Yoma, that on Yom Kippur he takes the blood of the pod in the Kodesh Kodashim and sprinkles onto the parochet. And it says he sprinkles 1 up and 7 down. And right now we're assuming that means 1 on the top half of it and 7 on the bottom half of that curtain. So there you go. There's a one case where we do up and down, and we say, no, you misunderstood. Achat lemala and achat lemata doesn't mean on the top half and bottom half. Actually, lemala means underhanded, and lemata means you throw it overhand, right, with the palm up or with the palm down. And furthermore, when the point of that is kimaslif, you're going to sprinkle it like a matzlif. My kimaslif, what does that word even mean? Machveh Rav Yehuda kemangedana. Rav Yehuda did a hand demonstration, a hand gesture, showing like someone who whips. When you whip someone on the back, for like a Betin does, so he does it in different spots on his back, not always in the same spot. So you might start at the top and then go down. And so that's the point, that when he's sprinkling, he starts further away from him, and then goes down, or closer and closer. And actually, the blood doesn't even have to reach the curtain; it has to be towards the curtain. So whether it lands on the curtain or on the floor in between, the point is, the first one will be will be underhanded, so that will go farthest, and then overhanded will go actually shorter. And so that just means you go down the line. But it's not talking about the top half of the curtain and bottom half of the curtain. There's no law like that has to be on the top half and bottom half. They're just saying that you do underhand, overhand, and you make them closer and closer. Or maybe another example of where you see that blood is placed above and below. And this is in another case regarding a different Mishnah, Masechet Yoma. And this is where the Kohen Gadol will place the blood on the Mizbeach itself. He puts it on the four corners, and then it says that he puts it on the Tahor, part of the Mizbeach. What does it mean, the tahor part of the Mizbeach? Does that not mean the middle part? My love, palge de Mizbeach. That means the middle. Now, if you're going to put a few different placements in the middle, they're not going to be all exactly in the middle. It's 7 times. So that means some of them are going to be above the middle and some below the middle. So that's a good example where you have some above and some below. And where do we see that the word tahor means the middle? There's a common folk saying that people say, now is the clear part of the day, and that means noon. So there you go. Now that's not what the pure part of the Mizbeach. It does not mean the middle, but rather it means that it's bare. Usually on the Mizbeach there's coals and there's incense. You have to move everything away until the gold itself is visible, and he has to put the 7 sprinklings of the blood directly onto the shininess of the Mizbeach. That's what it means, but it doesn't have to be exactly in the middle, and therefore you wouldn't say it's some of them above the middle, some below the middle. So that's not a good precedent for some above and some below either. Hold on, what about the remainder of the blood? Like even for Korban Chatat, where you place the blood above the red line, but then the remainder of the blood that's still in the cup, you pour at the base. So that's some up and some down. So therefore we could also read v'chiper to mean some up and some down. No, shirayim la me'akevi. No, the pouring of the blood on the base is not necessary for atonement. And so we're not counting things that are not essential for atonement. We want to know how things that you do above and below that are essential avodot. V'aika shirayim ha'penimit. Shiraim ha'penimim tika demandamar me'akevi. What about the blood that is sprinkled inside inside the hechal? And there is an opinion that says when you sprinkle blood inside, you have to pour the remainder on the base of the outside Mizbeach. And so that is something that is ma'akev. It is essential. And you're doing some above, because you're putting it on the horns of the inner altar, and some below in the outer altar. So isn't that a good precedent? We say no. Bechad makom kamedinan. We mean in one place, not that some of it's on the higher part of the inside altar and then the lower part of the outside altar. That's not considered precedent. We were looking for a precedent for something that you do above and below on the same vessel. And we don't have anything like that. Therefore, we reject that reading that the word v'chiper is teaching you that you don't have to do all 4 above the line on the corners, and you could do some below. That can't be a good reading of v'chiper because there is no precedent for anything being both above and below. And therefore, we are left with the original derivation for Bet Hillel that the 3 instances of v'chiper are coming to teach me that best to have 4 corners for a korban chatat, but Ish v'chiper says, well, if you don't have that, if you don't have the third, if you don't have the second, or if you don't have the third all together, and you have only 1 placement, still, b'diavad, that is okay, and that's the opinion of Bet Hillel. Tanya, Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov Omer, Bet Shammai Omerim, Shete matanot shebechatat ve'achat shebechol haZevaḥim matirot. And the Braita, Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov teaches that according to Bet Shammai, with the Korban Chatat, again, ideally you should have 4 sprinklings on each, dabbings on each of the corners. But if you did just 2 regarding a Korban Chatat, or for other Korbanot, if you did just 1, then not only is that sufficient to give atonement, also it makes the Korban permitted to eat. the parts of it that one can eat, one is permitted to eat at that point because you did the minimum amount of placements. Umefagelot, also, it can become pigul, since those are the necessary amount of things that you have to do. If one has wrong intention to consume outside the time, and one did only 2 or only 1 for chatat and for other korbanot of the sprinklings, then it's already pigul, because it becomes pigul once you complete the process otherwise properly, and is permitted to eat. So it goes hand in hand. Because it's permitted to eat now, so you did everything correctly, except that you did something with intention out of time, so therefore it becomes pigul, although you have not done the other 2 or 3 placements. Bet Hillel omrim, achat shebechatat ve'achat shebechol hazevaḥim materet umefagelet. The Bet Hillel says 1 is sufficient, both for chatat and for all other korbanot. As long as you did 1 placement on the mizbeach, it's permitted to eat, and also, if one had improper intention, it will make it pigul. מתקיף לה רב אושיה, אם כן, להתניה גבי כולי בית שמאי וחומרי בית הלל. Rav Oshaya challenges this, because if this is true, then this should be listed in Masechet Eduyot as a list of all the things where Bet Shammai is more lenient. And this should be one of them, because when it comes to pigul, it's harder, according to Bet Shammai, it's harder for it to become pigul, because you need 2 sprinklings in order for it to become pigul, whereas Bet Hillel, all you need is 1 sprinkling, and it's already pigul. So that's a leniency for Bet Shammai. How come this one is not listed there? And the answer is, Amar le Rava, ki itshil lehetera itshil, tavu lehu Bet Shammai lechumra. When this topic came up, and when they were talking about all this issue, when the people asked about it, they asked about it from the direction of permission to eat. And if you look at focus on that part of it, well then Bet Shammai is actually more machmir, because he would say you need 2 sprinklings in order for to permit it to be consumed, whereas according to Bet Hillel you only need 1. So Bet Hillel is actually more lenient. And so within this very halacha, these 2 things are tied together, and so Bet Hillel, who requires 1, that's a leniency for eating, a stringency for pigul, and vice versa. For the on the other way around, and therefore you have to, one of them, it's going to be a leniency one way and stringency in the other way, and therefore when this was asked, it was asked regarding the permission to eat, and that is in fact a leniency for Bet Hillel. That's why it was not included in the Mishnah Masechet Eduyot. אמר רבי יוחנן, 3 מתנות שבחטאות, אינן באות בלילה, ובאות לאחר מיתה, והמלא מהן בחוץ חייב. Rabbi Yochanan says that the 3 later offerings in a chatat, according to Bet Hillel, only the first one is necessary. Therefore, the first one has all the stringencies and laws of a necessary avodah. But the next 3 have an in-between status, and that they cannot be brought at night. So in that sense, it's like a necessary avodah, like the first one, that has to be done during the day and not at night. But it's different from the first one, because you can still bring the last 3 even after the death of the owner. If the owner dies before the first sprinkling, then there's no owner for this chatat, and you cannot continue. You have to throw it out. But as long as you did 1, then since now he's atoned, you can continue and do the other 3. So in that sense, the next 3 are not like the first one. And furthermore, if someone offers this blood outside of the Bet HaMikdash, one is liable to karet, just like the first one. In other words, it's an essential avodah, and in that sense, the last 3 are like the first one, that chayav karet for offering it outside. Rav Papa is going to expand on the statement of Rabbi Yochanan. Amar Rav Papa, yesh mehen ketechilato, v'yesh mehen kesofo. There are some ways in which the last 3 sprinklings are like the first, the beginning, and there are some ways in which those 3 sprinklings are like the end, meaning the pouring of the extra blood on the base, which is not an essential service. And so it has some ways that are like both. What's the first list? Chutz, the last 3 sprinklings are like the first one in that if you offer it outside of the Bet HaMikdash, then one will be liable karet. Ve'laila, that they have to be done during the day, like all 4 cannot be done at night. Zarut, if a non-Kohen offers it, he will be chayab mita bidei shamayim, applies to all 4. Klei sharet, all have to be given in a vessel. Keren, all of them have to be placed on the corner corner. Etzba has to be placed on the top corner of the horn of the mizbeach with one's finger, not thrown, but placed with one's finger. Kibus, if the blood gets on the garments of the kohen, that has to be washed. And shirayim, and the remainder has to be poured on the base of the altar. So ketchilatan, in all those ways, the 3 sprinklings that are not necessary have the same law as the first one. However, ubaot lachar mita la sharia vela mefagela vela ayla legavai kesofan. In other ways, these 3 are like the end, meaning like pouring it out, and meaning that they're less stringent. How so? That it is not needed for permission to consume the korban, because you already have permission after sprinkling the first one. So the next 3 sprinklings is like the pouring out. They're not necessary as a permission. They would not be involved in pigul. Vela me fagela. It would become pigul after the first sprinkling if something was done with wrong intent. And so it doesn't matter if you do or don't do the last 3, or if you have wrong intention in one of those 3, it is not going to make it pigul. And the law does not apply to this, that if you bring it into the hechal, then that blood is disqualified. That is true for the first one, that if you bring the blood into the hechal, you cannot use that for the first sprinkling, but that law does not apply to the second, third, and fourth sprinkling, just as it does not apply to the remainder being poured of the blood that needs to be poured on the base. And so these 3 sprinklings are in some ways essential, like the first, but in some ways are not essential, like the pouring of the remnant of the blood on the base of the mizbeach. Amar Rav Papa, Mina Amina La. Rav Papa says, what's my proof that one has to launder the garments of a kohen if some of the blood splattered on it after he already sprinkled the first one, but the blood that is used to sprinkle the second, third, and fourth time is considered the same status, high status, and therefore one has to launder the clothing. Ditnan, nitaz min hasavar ala beged eno ta'on kibus, min hakeren min haisod eno ta'on kibus, ha min hara'ui lekeren ta'on kibus. The proof is from a Mishnah later on in this Masechet that says, if some blood squirted from the neck of the animal onto the garment, it is not required to launder it. I mean, you can launder it to be clean, but there's no mitzvah that you have to launder it. We're going to learn the mitzvah from this pasuk here, Asher Yizeh. So this mitzvah does not apply to blood that comes from the neck onto the clothing, nor does it apply to blood that was applied already to the horn and then, let's say, bounced off of the horn or fell off, spilled off of the horn, or from the base of it and then soiled the garment. That in all those cases, one does not have a mitzvah, a commandment, a requirement to wash the garment, and those enotan kibus. That's all the Mishnah says. Rav Papa says, I can infer from here that if it is fit for the keren, meaning it hasn't been put on the keren already and then splattered off of it, but rather is in the cup and is able to be put onto the keren, then it needs to be laundered if that blood gets on the garment. Now, that's true for not only the first sprinkling, but also second, third, and fourth. That blood that was not yet put on, but that you're going to put on second, third, and fourth corners, if it goes on the garment, will require it. That's the implication from the Mishnah. But we challenge this implication because this inference was made from the word min hakeren, but you could use the same logic for the word min hayesod and say, if it's already on the base, then and then bounces off or splatters off the base onto the clothing, you don't have to wash it. But the inference would be, if it's something that still can be and should be poured on the base, then you would need kibus, and that would mean even after you did all 4 sprinklings, the leftover blood that needs to be poured on, still, if that blood would require laundering if it got onto the garment. But that goes against the common reading of the pasuk that says, Asher yizeh ketib, that will be sprinkled, perat hazeh asher shekevar huzah. That comes to exclude any blood that was already sprinkled, and this blood was already sprinkled, did all 4 sprinklings, and therefore should not require the laundering, even though it still has to be put on the base. So that is the majority opinion. So we answer, Hamani Rabbi Nechemya. Okay, you know what? The author of this Mishnah must be Rabbi Nechemya. And then we will accept both of these inferences, and we can do that and say we're following Rabbi Nechemya, and Rav Papa can follow this opinion, because Rav Papa is just interested in saying that the 3 sprinklings are like the first sprinkling, and they're not like blood that's already on the yesod, which would not require laundering. And so we can follow the opinion of Rabbi Nechemya. Hamaneh Rabbi Nechemya. Ditnan Rabbi Nechemya Omer Shiyareh Hadam Shikriban Bachutz Chayav. Where explains that actually this conclusion that you just said, that even that which is left over in the cup that needs to be poured onto the altar, that also has a high status of holiness, and one would need to launder clothes if it fell on the clothing. Actually, that is true according to Rabbi Nechemya. And so he could be the author of the Mishnah, even with this implication. As we see in yet a different Mishnah, Rabbi Nechemya says that the leftover of blood, that if you take that blood and you're supposed to pour it onto the base of the altar, if you take it outside of the Bet HaMikdash, one is liable. You're not allowed to do that, meaning that we're treating that blood at a high level, same as if before it was sprinkled. Therefore, if that's true for the law of taking it outside of the Mikdash, it should be also true for the law of laundering. So yes, in fact, Rabbi Nechemya thinks that. Ema deshmat Rabbi Nechemya linan ha'ala'a midi dehave ha'evarim ufedarim linan kibus mishamat le. Hold on. We know that Rabbi Nechemya would say that the blood that it needs to be, you already sprinkled it, but just needs to be poured onto the base, that would be prohibited to take it outside of the Bet HaMikdash and offer it outside the Bet HaMikdash. Yes, that I understand he would say that. And that because the same would be true for the limbs and fats of the animal that get burnt on the Mizbeach, even though that's post all the sprinkling. That also, if you take it out of the Mikdash and offer it outside, one would be liable. So that makes sense that blood would be equal in status and law to the limbs and fats. But regarding the law of requiring laundering, does Rabbi Nechemya also say that? Such that you would say, oh yes, and he's the author of that Mishnah, together with the implication that Rav Papa made. Would Rabbi Nechemya go that far? He didn't say that explicitly in this Mishnah. And the answer is, yes, indeed, we know he does say that, because we learned in the following Baraita. The following Baraita is not named, but we're going to prove in a second that it must be Rabbi Nechemya. It says, Damin na teonin yesod, teonin kibus. Any blood that needs to be poured onto the base also will require laundering of the garment if it falls on the garment. And if you have improper intent outside the time regarding that blood, it will make it pigul. And if you offer it outside the Bet HaMikdash, one is liable. That's true for that type of blood. But blood that needs to be poured out into the drain of the courtyard, lower level, not on the base of the altar, but just down the drain. And tonin kibus, if that blood falls on a garment, you don't have to wash it. If you have improper intent regarding that blood, it will not make it pigul. And if you offer it outside the Bet Mikdash, one is not liable. Okay, so that's the 2 different categories. Now, who is of the opinion that if you offer it outside of the Mikdash, that blood that needs to be put on the Yesod, one would be liable? Rabbi Nechemya said that. He said that explicitly in the Mishnah above. And yet, he also says that it requires laundering. So you see, he applies the law also to laundering. So yes, in fact, the Rav Papa's reading of the Mishnah would follow Rabbi Nechemya. And now the Gemara asks about this Baraita, is that true? That blood that is waiting to be poured onto the base, if one has improper intention outside the time, then it would become pigul. והתניא, יעשו שיריים והקטרת אמורין שאין מעכבין את הכפרה, שאין מחשבה מועלת בהן. A Baraita teaches that we exclude that blood, the extra blood that needs to be poured on the base, and the innards of the sacrifice, that are burnt on the Mizbeach, those that are not required for atonement. And therefore, if one has improper intent regarding those things, then it does not make it pigul. So therefore, that blood does not make it pigul. Why in this Baraita does it say that if one has improper intent with the blood that has to go on the base, it does make it pigul? Oh, actually, this Baraita, when it says Damim HaTeonim Yesod, that's actually talking about the blood that is used for the three sprinklings after the first sprinkling, not for the blood that goes on to the that needs to go onto the base. If so, the Baraita doesn't say that. Why does it say that needs to be put on the base? It should say that needs to be put on the horns of the Mizbeach. Emanit anin yesod. Okay, so read it as not te'onin, but that will become required for the base after it's sprinkled to the keren. A difficult reading, but let's go with it. Okay, even that. Does improper thought of time make it pigul? Ha'amad la sharia vela mefagela vela alya legavai kesofan. But we already learned that those three sprinklings are not required to make it permitted to eat. And if you have improper intention, it does not make it pigul. And the law that if you offer it outside, then one is liable does not apply to them because they are like sofan. They are like the blood that is poured onto the base. And therefore, a machshava will not make it pigul, even for those sprinklings, even if you say it's for those sprinklings. Ela kitanyahi b'damim hapinimim. Okay, rather, that the Braita on the top of this page is actually talking about blood that's sprinkled inside. That's what it's talking about. And yes, it applies to that. Okay, so then you're telling me that if it's outside, if it's blood that needs to be sprinkled on the outside Mizbeach, and you have improper intention, so you're saying patur, adetane damim hanishpachim le'amma liflog v'litne bedida. B'amed rememorim b'damim ha'penimim. Ava b'damim chitzonim patur. If so, then the Baraita should have made a finer distinction. Instead of making the distinction between damim ha'teonim yesod and damim hanishpachin le'ama, which is that goes down the drain, a big distinction, you should have instead of doing separating this between that which is poured down the drain, let it make a distinction within the blood that is meant for the base, and say, when is this true that it will make it pigul with wrong thoughts? That's if it's blood that is sprinkled in the inside of the hechal, but on the outside, then one would not be liable. It's always better to make a finer distinction. And the final answer is Hamaneh Rabbi Nechemyahi. We already said before that the author of this Baraita is Rabbi Nechemya. Damash yireh hadam shikrivan bachutz hayav vela miteni le tilata petureh lebahadeh tilata chiyuveh. And he said that the remnants of the blood that were offered outside are liable, and that is true also of blood that is sprinkled on the outside Mizbeach. And therefore, this would not be a distinction, according to Rabbi Nechemya, this Shirei Hadam law would not be a distinction between blood that is brought inside and blood that is brought outside. And therefore, he would not be able to teach all three laws that are patur in the second case, that are corresponding to all three laws that are chayav in the first case. And so therefore, Rabbi Nechemya did not choose to make a distinction between blood that's sprinkled inside and blood that's sprinkled outside, because then he couldn't bring all three contrasting laws. And so instead, he chose a blood that is put on the base versus blood that is poured down the drain, because only in that case do you have all three of the distinctions. Baruch Adonai Le'olam, Amen ve'amen.